oh, this company raised $10 million. I'm really, really honored to be here. Thank you very much, you all, for having me. Actually, this is the second time I've actually been in Tbilisi. I came out here in 2013, and I will have to admit that was actually one of the biggest highlights actually of my year. And coming back, just like landed here last night at about 3 a.m., and I've been walking around a little bit this afternoon, city's actually changed a lot, and actually for the good. I'm very, very impressed by what I've seen the last 6 years. I'm very embarrassed I have not been back since then. So I've kind of gone a little bit off script. This is like 500 Startups Wave Acceleration. I think we had a miscomm, so I'm going to talk about sort of like fundraising. So this is a little bit of a different presentation. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about some general myths and things about like Silicon Valley that I hope will be interesting for you. Then I'm going to talk about some best practices and things about like fundraising, which is what people seem to care about. And then I think that's pretty much it. And then we'll take it from there. And so before we get started, who am I? How am I hopefully credible to sort of be able to speak in front of you all? My name is Marvin. I'm actually a partner of 500 Startups, and so I'll tell you a little bit about 500 and a little bit about myself. So 500 Startups is an early stage venture capital fund. We've been around now for about 9 years, and about 8 years ago, we started an accelerator program, which is now considered one of the top 2, top 3 programs globally. And so I think what we're very, very well known for is really for 2 things. Number one, for doing lots and lots of investments. So we have invested in close to 2,300 companies in the pre-seed and seed stage across the globe. That's number one. And number two, actually the fact that being based in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and investing probably 50% of our portfolio is actually outside of the US, which also makes us a little bit unique. And so the sample set and the data set that we actually have on what works, on the type of companies, I don't think any firm actually has what we have in the early stage. A bit about myself. So partner of 500 Startups, been there about 6 years. I started the San Francisco office. I've been running the core San Francisco accelerator program now for almost 6 years now. It'll be 6 years in February. I've actually invested in close to 415 companies. I actually counted that up last week. I was like, invested in over 415 pre-seed and seed companies. So I see a lot of stuff. But before this, I was actually an operator. I was an executive at Yahoo for about 10 and a half years. And prior to that, I was actually at a startup that raised about $30 million and actually imploded. And so I've also been on that side of the fence too. So let's jump into it. So talk a little bit about sort of my sort of like experience, and talk a little bit about where the context of what I'm going to say. And so I'm Canadian, but actually moved to San Francisco about 20 years ago. And I know a lot of people's aspirations is actually to target the US, and it makes sense. The US is the biggest market in the world. But one thing I will say is that I actually think in the beginning, you do have to start small and actually focus on a very, very narrow customer segment in general. And so it doesn't always make sense to jump to the US right away, but if you can, that isn't necessarily a bad strategy. But one thing I will mention too is that the US market is a very advanced market. Silicon Valley has been around now for over, I think like 50, 60 years. And so it's incredibly competitive. And we kind of jokingly call it the Las Vegas of work, right? Because it's highly competitive right now. So first myth, a couple of things I've learned over the last 20 years in San Francisco. And I think this is something that the media and the tech media actually puts in place that I think is false. The myth is this overnight success, right? Some startup, hear the story, young person graduated from Stanford, and then, like 1 year later on, they're a unicorn, right? Over $1 billion company. That's what everyone seems to think. The reality is, it takes a very, very long time. And so what I tell folks is that, and this is a small enough audience, do you want to know how long it actually takes on average for a company to get to product to market fit? Any guesses? 2 to 4 years, that's right. It takes 2 to 4 years to get to product to market fit. But for large exits, you know how long it actually takes for, like say several $100 million exit, $1 billion exit? Do you know how long it takes for a company to go public? 9 to 12 years. 9 to 12 years. So the point is it takes a very, very, very long time. All right? So do not buy on all the sort of like the TechCrunch bullshit about the fact, so I shouldn't swear, I saw there's a kid here, I'm not gonna swear. The TechCrunch BS about just this overnight success, because it's actually not true. This stuff is really, really hard. Second thing, right? And this is actually very, very common, still in Silicon Valley, very, very common, I think particularly in this region where there's actually a lot of strong technical talent, this idea that all you need is technology and the product, right? Build it and they will come. Actually, not true. Actually, the most important thing is actually marketing, of what the market is, and actually distribution, right? How you get your product in the hands of the customer, whether you're B2B or B2C. And why is this actually more relevant now than it was before? And so the example I actually used was that if you think about 10 years ago, the Apple App Store, right? There were probably several thousand apps on the Apple App Store, weren't that many products, right? So all you actually really needed to stand out was to have a great product. Fast forward now, there's over 2 million apps in the Apple App Store. And you look at almost every single sector now, there's just tons and tons of products in every single sector. And so actually distribution and actually marketing is actually way more important now, I would argue, right? Having a good high quality product is table stakes. That's what you need to just get started. All right. Myth, Silicon Valley is the center of the world, right? So center of sort of like the, I would say, technical world. I actually disagree with that. And so if you take a look at the numbers, about even 5 years ago, if you look at the number of unicorns, terrible term, but companies are valued over $1 billion. You know, probably about 80% of them were actually in the US, 20% of them international, mainly China. Fast forward now, it's about 50-50. And so 50% of the unicorns now are actually US, 50% of unicorns actually from all over the world now. And so you're seeing a distribution of actually tech, of huge tech companies growing from all over the place. And actually the dirty secret too is actually most of the unicorns in the US, a lot of them were started by foreign founders or actually companies that actually started somewhere else, right? So one of my favorite companies, a company called UiPath, is actually a Romanian company. Everyone thinks it's an American company, it's actually a Romanian company. They're based in New York now, but started off in Bucharest, I think close to like 8 or 9 years ago. And so what you're seeing is actually this distribution and flattening. And so this actually is why I'm so excited about what's happening around the world now. You're seeing amazing companies actually come from anywhere. Myth, right? Importance of the idea. How many times do you get this from founders? They're just like, yeah, you know what? I'm really careful like sharing sort of like what I'm working on because I think somebody's gonna steal my idea, right? Truth is, nobody's going to steal your idea. The execution is actually everything. And I think this is actually due to that horrible movie, The Social Network, right? You know, somebody stole the idea of Facebook. Ridiculous, ridiculous. They executed very well, right? They executed very well. Execution is everything. Great quote, ideas are worthless, execution is everything by Scott Adams, right? And so it's actually true. This stuff is really hard. And so, you know, I can tell you why this is actually, idea is actually very, very, not very important in my opinion, because I travel all over the world. I speak at probably 40 or 50 conferences a year, you know, and all across the globe. And one of the things I see in almost every single country I go to, I see the same idea replicated almost around the same time, right? And so the reality is actually how you win is by executing better and servicing the customer better than anybody else. And this stuff is really hard. And so this idea, just like, you will always have a lot of competition in general. Myth, in Silicon Valley, easy VC money, right? It's easy to raise VC money. It's actually really, really, really hard if you take a look at the funnel. So yes, there's a lot of VCs, there's a lot of money in Silicon Valley, a lot of angels. But the problem is also there's a lot of startups. And there's a lot of really, really high quality startups, so there's a lot of noise. And so fundraising is one of the toughest things in general, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the fundraising process and whatnot. So do not think, and I get this, there's this myth of just like, it's so easy to raise money in Silicon Valley, it's so hard to raise where I am right now, whether it's in London or wherever, right, in Asia. I'm going to go to Silicon Valley, I'm just going to raise money there because it's easy. That's actually not true, and it is a myth. Other thing, right? And this is something that's ironic talking about fundraising, and I'm bagging on fundraising, but if you think about this idea too in the media, just like, oh, this company raised $10 million, this company raised $50 million, this company raised $100 million, they must be awesome. Not true. This is a great example, right? Airware, $118 million, and I have many companies in my personal portfolio have raised like 15, 20, $30 million, and they die. They literally die a year later on. And because of the fact that having a lot of money doesn't necessarily guarantee success, a lot of times you don't even know what to do with it. A lot of times you actually can't hire the talent to actually spend it. A lot of times you actually get fat and lazy and spend it on stupid stuff, right? And that's actually what happens. You actually die in some cases of actually indigestion. Or in many cases, you end up throwing money at a problem when the constraint of actually not having money, she forces you to actually do stuff more creatively. And so this is actually one of the reasons I actually think, no offense to corporate people in the room, this is one of the reasons big companies and corporates suck at innovation, right? Because on paper, they go lots of smart people, and on paper, they actually have quite a lot of money, they have a lot of resources, they have this huge brand that a lot of people know, they should be crushing it. The reason they actually don't do well in any real innovation at all, or at least disruptive innovation, is because they have too much money, right? Because there's no sense of urgency, right? Think about it as a startup, because you don't have a lot of money, you're really, really, really focused. So you have a massive sense of urgency. If I don't get this thing done now, I'm gonna die, my company's gonna die. It's very different at a big company, right? You have a lot of money, you're like, I can wait until next week. Or you have to get buy-in from a bunch of different people. So this is actually one of the reasons actually startups are the driver of innovations, because the constraint of time and the constraint of money, the lack of money, forces them to be super creative and work very, very hard. And so there's a power of constraints in general. All right, and so I know I'm ending this sort of on a weird way, this part of the presentation, but congratulating the entrepreneur for raising money is like congratulating a chef for buying the ingredients, right? Fundraising is a tool, is a valuable tool, but it's just a tool, and it doesn't guarantee success. In many cases, you're better off bootstrapping. So all right, now I'm gonna talk about fundraising, fundraising from VCs. But anyway, just a data point. And so I'm gonna talk about fundraising basics and elements. And I think this is relevant for whatever you do in general. And so number one, storytelling. And I use the example of Pixar, Disney Pixar all the time. This is actually something that everybody needs to work on, but particularly if you're fundraising, particularly if you're in sales. And so the example I ask people, just like, how much time do you actually think in Disney, at Pixar, and this is relevant for all their movies, do they actually spend on actually animating the movie? Anyone want to have any guesses? How much time do you actually spend on the animation versus everything else of the movie? It's actually 20% of their time is actually spent on animating the film. 80% of the time is actually on the story and the character development, right? That's why all their movies are really good, right? And I look at all the other Hollywood movies, which have like amazing special effects, but no storyline, and they suck, right? And that's why they don't do well. It's the same with your pitch in general, and same with your story. What is your company's story? What is your story? You need to think about this. Other thing, as a VC, and I think this is really, 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 really important, just as a VC, I have to invest in companies that could potentially be a billion-dollar company, right? More than billion-dollar company. And that's why the markets need to be huge, right? And so you have to look at what reality is. Just you have to be very, very honest with yourself and look at this and just go, am I focusing on a huge, massive market or not? If you're focused on becoming the, I don't know, whatever, the Uber of like Georgia, it's probably not going to be a huge market. It's probably a nice business, hard business, but it's probably going to be a decent sized business, but I don't know if that's going to be a VC fundable business, right? And so for a VC fundable business, it has to be a big, massive market, or it could be a small market that will eventually grow into a big market. It could be a small market where there's an adjacency to a bigger market, but it has to lead to a larger market in the long run. And if it is not one of those, you're better off bootstrapping because you're probably not a VC fundable business, and that's okay. Competition. This is actually very, very important, right? I mentioned to you this earlier. Every business that you have, whatever business you're building, will have some form of competition, right? And so when I talk to founders and I ask them questions like, who's your competition? And the answer is like, I don't have competition. Why is that a bad answer, right? That's a bad answer for two reasons. Number one, you're probably an idiot and you didn't do the homework and actually Google it and see you actually had competition. That means you're a crappy founder. Or number two, you have no competition because there's actually no market and there's no need for what you're building. And so the reality is that whatever you have, the reality is that if it's a real market and a real business, you probably do have competition. And so I want to know that you've actually thought about it and you've done your homework. Second part, right? Not only do you have competition, how are you different and how are you substantially better? Not like 20% better. I'm talking like 5, 6, 10x better than your competition, right? How are you 10x better than your competition? So the differentiation is actually really important. And I actually think this is a differentiation that I look for in a startup founder, right? They need to understand how they're going to win versus the competition. Knowing the competition and how they're going to win. And you'd be surprised at how few founders actually have an answer for this or even think about this. Product to market fit. I mentioned to you, right? 2 to 4 years it takes for product to market fit. So any founder that I meet, these are some of my companies. I just invested recently in like about 5 or 6 companies. And the first question I ask them is like, where do you think you are in the product to market fit? And they're like, oh, I'm working on it for 6 months. So I'm gonna say probably like 2 or 3 more months, or even worse, I'm at product to market fit right now. And my answer is like, BS. There's no way you're at product to market fit. And what I tell people is just, how do you know you're product to market fit? In the beginning, you're pushing and you're pushing and you're pushing your product, right? You're trying a bunch of different ways and you're trying a bunch of different audience segments to sort of like get your product out there, and it's not sticking, right? You know you actually have product to market fit when actually the market's actually pulling you in, right? When you cannot keep up with the growth. Right? So for example, from a sales perspective, you literally cannot keep up with the growth, right? You can't service all the customers coming in, or you're seeing this huge, massive inflection of growth in general. Not like organic growth, not ad-driven growth, but organic growth. That's when you know you have product to market fit. And it's really hard, right? 2 to 4 years, and the reality is that most companies never find it. And the growth and traction, right? One of the things I'll tell companies is, and tends to be an issue more in this region, I'm talking like CEE, Europe region, Asia region. I think there's something about the humbleness here, which doesn't exist in the US as an observation, just as an observation. If you have traction, talk about the traction that you have, because this is a good thing. It means something is working. Right? Even if it's a little bit of traction, it means something's working. And for some reason, I've talked to a lot of founders from the region. They're like, you talk and it's like 20 minutes in, and then you find out like, wait a minute, what you're doing like $50,000 or $100,000 in monthly recurring revenue. You have these amazing customers. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Because that actually gives you credibility. Don't be embarrassed about talking about this. This is important. It means something is working. The magic number, if you're going to target the US or you're targeting the UK and you want to raise money in that market, I actually think, and this is what I've seen in general, most of my international companies actually come to the US and they want to raise money. I tell them, I'm like, okay, tell me what the sort of the rough number of customers or the revenue makeup of actually US customers right now. If it's less than 40%, you're not going to raise money in the US. I want to see it's 40% and actually growing. And this is something I've seen consistently. So actually many of my best performing companies, Aircall, French company, ManyChat, Russian company. If you take a look at Pipefy, Brazilian company, Worthix, Brazilian company. These are all companies from like founders from all over the world. Shippo, German founder. Most of their customer base is 40 to 60% US based before they came over and were able to raise in the US, right? So, or any other market. If you want to go to the UK market, this is relevant there too. It's going to be very, very hard for you to raise money in the UK without having a substantial base of the customer base over there. Team, right? In pre-seed and seed, this is the most important thing. One of the most important things is the team. And it's a balanced team. Right? Because in lieu of not having a lot of traction, we judge you on like how qualified, how smart, just sort of like how balanced a team is. And I think in this day and age, there's this like rule of 3, right? Someone that's actually really strong on the business side, someone that's actually really, really strong on the technical side to build, and actually someone that's actually really strong on the design side. UX now is a key differentiator, in my opinion. And if you take a look at what's happening, particularly everything's so mobile-driven now, UX is actually a critical key for standing out. Enterprise software is a critical key, like UX. Like, you think about most enterprise software products, right? They all suck because they're really hard to use. And so this is a major differentiator. All right. The other part, think about sort of why you're doing this, right? And I would caution any founder, if you think that your goal is to basically build a product and then sell it in like 2 years, number one, you're an idiot, because that very rarely ever happens. Your goal is to go start a company, sell it to Google, Facebook, whoever in 2 years from now. That doesn't happen, number one. And so that's what I classify as like classic mercenary, right? What we're looking to invest in is actually missionaries. As an investor, and I talk to many of my VC friends, we are finely attuned to founders who actually are working on products or working on problems that they actually really care about, right? They're not people who are like, I'm going to go build this and sell this in 2 years. Like, I'm going to work on this until I fix this thing. And it could be 9, 10, 12, 15 years, right? I'm looking to invest in missionaries, right? People who are very mission-driven. And the reason for this is because, number one, it's really hard, right? It takes a long time to have an exit anyways. But the fact that it's really, really hard, mercenaries quit when it gets really hard. I think that's one of the challenges where, generally speaking, at least I speak about the US, or at least a good part of the US and Canada, we're full employment right now. So doing startups where it's like you have the option of doing a startup or actually going and working at like a Facebook or Google or Amazon, right? And so what happens when you work on a startup and it gets tough, you're like, you know what, screw this, I don't want to work on this anymore. I'm just gonna quit and actually just go get a $150,000 a year job at like Google, right? And you can do that now. And this is actually what happens with mercenaries. So I want to be investing in missionaries, people who are gonna stick with it for a very long time, right? People who actually really care about the problem that they're trying to solve. And this is, I'm speaking as a VC. Vision, right? Make sure you have a vision and thinking about this, sort of like thinking a lot bigger. I actually think one of the challenges with a lot of the emerging ecosystems is that they think too small. And I actually, I think if you look at the data now, the fact that most founders from a lot of the successful founders are actually not from the US, right? But the fact is they come to the US and they get this big thinking and they're able to build huge things. And now you're seeing a lot more examples of actually people being able to build huge companies from all over the world. And so one of the things I would definitely tell all of you is like try to think bigger. If you're gonna start a company, it's actually just as much work to actually build something 10x bigger. It's the same amount of time, roughly, same amount of work. Just think a little bit bigger, right? And challenge yourself a little bit. And the vision actually matters, right? Make sure, in my opinion, you should make sure you're working on something that is society positive. I think as a VC, I look for that, right? That's why I don't invest in like gun companies. I don't invest in like, vaping companies or alcohol. I will invest in cannabis, but I won't invest in all this other stuff. Stuff that is actually society positive. And I think most investors in general, we want to make money, but we also want to be investing in stuff that is actually good for the world too. That matters. And so hopefully you want to be working on something that's also good for the world too. So to fundraise, key part is actually learning to network and build relationships, right? And there's a great saying in Silicon Valley, which is like, your network is your net worth, and it's true. That's how you're gonna get a lot of your customers, that's how you're gonna find new employees. That's actually sometimes how you find founders, right? Like, not founders, but how you find investors. And so this is actually, the network is something you should be building, not just within Georgia, but actually sort of extensively, right? And that's why I'm a big fan of events like this. That's why I'm a big fan of actually coming to events like this. You get to meet people from all over the world. And that actually helps you build out your network. So go and meet and talk with people on a regular basis. You never know, right? And don't be transactional about it. Legitimately get to know people, because they will be valuable in the long run. Intros matter. And so what I would say as a VC, I very rarely will invest in a company that actually pitches me cold, right, or cold emails me. And why is this important? Why do intros actually matter? It's because think about with tools now. You have like Signal, you have tools like LinkedIn. The fact is just, or even Twitter, right, like anything online, like it's relatively easy to, not easy, but simple. It's relatively simple to get in touch with people, right? And why intros actually matter? Because they're actually a filter. It's almost a way for me to judge whether you have the gumption and the sort of like the grit to go and find a way to get to me, right? Because getting an intro, if one of my friends, say, call and goes and says, hey, Marvin, please meet this founder or whatever, I'm gonna take that intro, right? I'm gonna actually spend time with them because the fact that Colin's vouching for this person, right? And also the fact that maybe that person actually found out that Colin knows me, so he found a way to get to me, that's actually a good thing. Because here's the way I think about this, right? If you can't find a way to get to me, you're probably a crappy salesperson. How are you gonna get to customers, right? Think about that. How are you gonna get to customers with all the tools that we have available now? And so it's maybe not as simple as that, but it's almost like a litmus test. And the other one is that you wanna treat the fundraise process actually like an enterprise sales process, right? Use a CRM. You want to identify sort of the people that are actually the right people that you want to target. You want to do your homework on them, like what stage are they investing in? Are they the right investor for me? Do they have expertise in what I'm doing? Or can they help me? Do they have a network? So you want to do the homework. And I'm continually surprised at how many founders don't do the homework. They come and ping me and they go, hey, I'm raising a Series A now. And I'm like, dude, like we're seed fund, right? Like we don't do Series A investments. Like do your homework, right? Or like, hey, I have this biotech company. I'm like, I don't do biotech investments. That's like very, very clear. As sexy as biotech is, I don't know anything about biotech. And I'm very, very clear about that, right? And so you have to treat the process like an enterprise sales process, right? Why would you go and pitch like Bank of Georgia and not do the homework on like what they are, what their problems are? Do the homework. And so I think what really, really thrills me about coming to regions now, especially this region now, just like it is like you're starting to see the spread of the Silicon Valley mindset, right? And so what I tell folks now is that this is the best time to be a startup in this region and to be a startup founder. This is the best time for me as an investor to be investing in this region. And so I hope you found this presentation helpful or interesting. And I look forward to meeting you all later on today as well as tomorrow, and hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.